If you've done any stargazing recently, you've probably seen a few satellites. There are thousands currently in orbit around the Earth. But it wasn't always this way. Back in the 90s, spotting a satellite felt special, more like seeing a shooting star. And this is when the U.S. fought what's now known as the very first space war.
Hi, Lacey. I'm Mike Lyons. I am a former captain of the Field Artillery. I commanded Alpha Battery 3rd of the 17th in Desert Storm, part of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment.
Just before the start of the Gulf War, Mike was stationed in Germany.
And it was all about the Russians. It was all about the great North German plain and the fact that World War III was going to start there. And we come home from work one day and all these Germans are standing on the Berlin Wall.
Not long after, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and Mike was deployed to Saudi Arabia.
That desert is got to be one of the most austere places on the planet. I mean, we would go for miles, not see anything. We would come across, camel graveyards. I can't begin to tell you what's out there. It looks like you were on a different planet at times.
Navigating such a wide open space was kind of a nightmare. And this is where some cutting edge space tech comes in, at least for the 90s.
Things were appearing in my battery that I'd never seen before. So one day, two of these funny-looking radio devices show up, and they were the GPS systems.
And they didn't look anything like the GPS you know today.
The box where the battery was in was about the size of a box that you'd buy a pair of cowboy boots with. Okay, so it was about that big, and it had a wire that was attached to a small handheld device that was the input device that you'd enter into.
And it was green.
It was green, that's right. We were green, my vehicles were green, we were all green. If Desert Storm didn't go well, all the historians would say, well, they brought all these green things down there, and that's what happened, right?
But whether it was fashioned for the desert or not, it worked.
Wasn't the most sexiest thing, and we had a lot of batteries that go with it, but boy, it really was the ultimate enabler.
With GPS, U.S. forces were able to navigate the desert in ways that Iraqi troops weren't expecting. It allowed them to move in unison and progress much faster than before. And the ultimate success of Desert Storm, the last clear military victory in U.S. history, by the way, relied heavily on GPS satellites. The decisive battle in the war is even named after the GPS coordinates where Mike and his battery fought.
Because as we were moving, we would continue to say the FLOT, the forward line of troops, is now the 6-8, is now the 6-9, is now the 7-1. The last thing that was said there was the 7-3, so that's why it became the Battle of the 7-3, likely because it was the last GPS position as to where the enemy was.
Of course, today, GPS isn't exactly wowing or surprising anyone. But space is still a big deal to the military. So much so that we now have a space force to defend U.S. assets in space. But we wondered, how far could this whole space war thing really go? I'm Lacey Healy, and this is Things That Go Boom.
What is actually going on with the economy nowadays? The price of gas? Inflation? Are we in a recession? I'm Jeff Guo, co-host of NPR's Planet Money. Come along with our super team of econ experts as we delve into the stories that show you how the world really works. That's Planet Money from NPR.
Very importantly, I'm hereby directing the Department of Defense and Pentagon to immediately begin the process necessary to establish a Space Force as the sixth branch of the armed forces. That's a big statement.
This big statement from Trump, it made waves back in 2018. Except Space Force wasn't actually Trump's idea. Teresa Hitchens is the senior space reporter at Breaking Defense.
The actual impetus for the creation of a Space Force came several years before Trump was elected, and it came from the Congress, from Congressman Mike Rogers of Alabama, a Republican, and Jim Cooper of Tennessee, a Democrat. And it was just something that Trump himself kind of glommed onto at one point and became kind of obsessed with.
It might not have been his idea, but in true Trump fashion, he did want the Space Force to be huge. Huge like a whole new department.
That did not happen. And actually, it was kind of rolled back by Congress and internally by the Pentagon. Remember, the Air Force did not wish to do this. They did not wish to divest themselves of space and of the space mission. especially at a time when space was getting much more attention and there was much more congressional willingness to fund space programs. So Trump wanted something more than what actually happened. But I think because people were willing to call it Space Force and not Space Corps, he went along with it.
Space Corps because, as a branch, Space Force is kind of like the Marine Corps. Space Force has its own general on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It has its own enlisted service members, but it actually lives under the Department of the Air Force, kind of like the Marine Corps lives under the Department of the Navy. So instead of Semper Fi, it's Semper Supra, which means always above. There's actually a lot about Space Force's branding that doesn't feel super original, like its logo, which looks a lot like the Starfleet logo from Star Trek, or the fact that the people who serve in the Space Force are called Guardians.
All right, Guardians, don't forget, this might be dangerous, so let's put on our mean faces.
Groot, put that thing away. Now, I don't want to tell you again.
Groot.
And Groot.
Whoa!
Hey.
To be fair, the logo has been around for years, and the whole Guardian thing, it comes from the Air Force Space Command's 1983 motto, Guardians of the High Frontier. But the jokes still kind of write themselves.
Spacemen, we are training for the worst case scenario, but the best case scenario is colonizing the galaxy. Imagine, years from now, you could be on some distant star harvesting corn.
All jokes aside, though, the actual mission of Space Force is pretty serious.
They provide space services to the rest of the military, so to the Army, to the Air Force, particularly communications, which is one of the big ones. They also pay attention to what's happening in space, so they are watching for potential collisions between satellites or satellites in a piece of space debris. They're also keeping tabs on missiles, so they have missile warning satellites that would warn the military and the president if a nuclear missile were headed toward the United States.
It's Space Force's job to make sure that our satellites are safe and ready to go when the military needs them, whether that's for detecting missiles, spying on North Korea, communicating in the field, or tracking natural disasters. And it's a difficult mission.
What they're trying to do right now is to figure out how to create a more resilient force structure. In the past, U.S. military space systems have consisted of small constellations or small networks of satellites that are very big and very expensive.
Satellites are big, juicy targets. And since we don't have very many of them, taking even a few offline could really hurt military capabilities.
So there are different ways to do resiliency. One is to, say, better protect your satellite systems from cyber attack, which means encrypting ground stations and uplinks and downlinks and et cetera. There are other ways to protect your satellites. Most imaging satellites that have cameras also have lenses that can go down if they detect a bright flare so that their lenses aren't burnt out by a laser or something, right?
Signals can also be jammed, or whole satellites can be blown up. The US, India, China, and Russia have all already tested anti-satellite weapons. And this is where Space Force gets concerned about space junk, which is a bigger problem than you might think.
There's already too much space debris. Even a piece as small as my thumbnail can kill your satellite because things are moving pretty fast up there. And the impact speeds are just the power of the impact, which is ginormous.
The Space Force is fundamentally defensive, satellite-based organization, and it is not going to be, a bunch of people in uniform fighting aliens on Mars.
That's Kate Kuzminski. She's a defense budget expert at the Center for a New American Security. And we wanted to talk to Kate because when it comes to space, the budget matters. It's always mattered.
This man stands on the threshold of outer space. This launching of the Russian satellite, which brings into the realm of possibility all those wild science fiction stories of interplanetary travel.
Chosen from many Americans who answered the president's call, these astronauts dedicated themselves to study, training, and physical conditioning.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
When President Kennedy announced that the U.S. would put astronauts on the moon, he was poetic and inspiring, sure. But he didn't really want to go if it wasn't worth it for national security.
Everything that we do ought to really be tied into getting onto the moon and ahead of the Russians.
Why can't it be tied to preeminence in space, which are your own words?
Because, by God, we've been telling everybody we're preeminent in space for 5 years. Nobody believes it because they have the booster and the satellite. Otherwise, we shouldn't be spending this kind of money because I'm not that interested in space.
It was, after all, a whole lot of money. Money that Kennedy needed Congress to greenlight.
Let it be clear that I am asking the Congress and the country to accept a firm commitment to a new course of action. $531 million in fiscal 62.
If we're headed back into another race, offensive, defensive, or otherwise, this relationship between the executive and Congress will look pretty much the same. President Biden just submitted a budget requesting $813 billion for national defense, which includes a bump in spending for Space Force. And not a cent will go out until Congress passes it. If this were healthcare or infrastructure spending, we might expect Congress to cut that request back a bit. But defense funding is a funny thing.
I think this is one of the really interesting areas in which you see an administration's priorities, regardless of who's in power, come from the administration. And then you actually see Congress sometimes add money to the request instead of reducing the number of dollars that are requested.
There are lots of reasons for this. Defense jobs in congressional districts, for one, and a defense industry that spends over $100 billion a year lobbying on behalf of those jobs. But last year, Congress tacked on billions of dollars to the defense budget with bipartisan support. And Congress setting new defense spending records every year, well, it's starting to look like a trend.
Certainly, there's been some critique, particularly on the right, but not only on the right, about it not actually being enough money to face the threats that we're looking at.
Biden's already requested the largest peacetime defense budget in history. And with or without a boost from Congress, U.S. defense spending will be multiple times larger than any other country in the world. Right now, Space Force makes up just a small part of that budget. But it's bigger than you might think. Here's Teresa again.
It's $24.5 billion.
But there's another $40 billion that falls in something called the black budget, which just means it's classified. So when we add up the numbers, we don't actually count it as part of that $813 billion request. But the thing is that most of what we do in space is classified.
Primarily the National Reconnaissance Office, which builds U.S. spy satellites, but also other agencies, other intelligence community agencies. And the bulk of that goes for space. So add that up.
All in all, it's about $65 billion. $65 billion that could easily grow.
Once you set up a service or an agency within DoD, there certainly creates a forward momentum to at least maintain what you have, if not expand it.
When we come back, what happens when congressional inertia meets the temptation to weaponize space? It's hard to talk about space without talking about Star Wars. That is, the Strategic Defense Initiative.
President Reagan today issued a formal directive to the National Security Council to begin initial research on the space-age missile defense system he proposed to the nation last night.
It was 1983, the same year Return of the Jedi hit theaters.
Our objective is a world of lasting peace. Deterrence between the United States and the Soviet Union has been achieved by a perception that both sides have sufficient nuclear capability to inflict unacceptable damage on the other. So far, this concept has served us well, but I've always been deeply disturbed, as I think you must be too, at the thought that this would be a permanent solution.
Reagan's call for peace via better technology, it sounds appealing, but there were a couple of big issues. Here's Teresa again.
So the Russians and the Chinese were, and have been, very concerned that U.S. missile defenses, particularly if they were put in space, were going to negate their nuclear deterrent and make it easier for the United States to coerce them because their nuclear weapons would not be sufficient to stave off coercion or even aggression.
And extra jumpy nuclear states are especially bad because of the second issue with missile defense.
So you have these two relatively small objects going very, very fast, and you're trying to create a collision between those two. So that's why you hear it described as hitting a bullet with a bullet. Technically, that's a really challenging thing to do, and it's really impressive that we can do it at all.
Dr. Laura Grego is a physicist and missile defense expert, and she told us that the technical mission of the SDI system was so challenging that it was never fully implemented. Even so, missile defense was a big dream with funding to match. And once it was integrated into America's overall defense system and congressional appropriations, its momentum was hard to stop. So we renamed it and reshuffled again. And now we have the Missile Defense Agency, which, despite serious effort and expense over the last several administrations, still isn't the infallible shield that Reagan envisioned for the country.
Even in the simplified test, its test record is not very impressive. It's,
Not very impressive, like...
About 50%.
Okay.
About 50% of the time it hits the target it's supposed to.
And because the success rate is so low, the current U.S. missile defense system isn't actually aimed at the countries with the strongest nuclear capabilities.
Where we are today is really focusing on defending against the long-range missiles of North Korea.
And why are we primarily concerned about North Korea? Doesn't this apply to other nuclear weapon states?
Well, it does, but it would be essentially just totally technically infeasible and economically infeasible to attempt to defend against the much larger and more sophisticated arsenals of, say, China or Russia. And the official policy of the U.S. is that we don't count on missile defense to do that we assume that nuclear deterrence is what is deterring those attacks.
So our ballistic missile defense system really is just pointed at North Korea. And that raises the question, is this something we really want? Or does it just exist because it's hard to change direction when it comes to national defense?
So that's sort of what you're saying. Is like once it's there, it's really hard to not be there, which is really reflective of the GMD system itself. It doesn't really work, but it's hard for people to give up on it.
And if it did work better, or if Russia or China had a really solid missile defense system, there would be a greater incentive to build better offensive weapons to keep a competitive edge, which could lead to an arms race. This push for military dominance extends to space as well.
There's been a long history of the U.S. talking about space with phrases like dominance, superiority, high ground, defend the high ground, master it. It sort of speaks to the U.S. not only keeping its satellites safe, but picking and choosing who gets to use it, where and when. So it's not just this defensive piece, it's going to be this offensive piece.
And we have to choose. Exactly how much offensive capability do we need?
There was a time when I would have argued that the U.S. should just not have offensive space weapons at all. I don't think that's realistic or feasible because Russia and China are building things to take out U.S. space capabilities, including things that are based in space. And so I think you have to be realistic about what you might need. But being realistic about what you might need also requires being realistic about what the implications and the possible second and third order consequences of those capabilities are.
We're already seeing more aggressive capabilities take shape.
We've also totally overhauled how we use military satellites. They've gone from being strategic assets that were primarily used to spy and to look for other people's nuclear weapons launches, to warn about missile launches, to being tools of actual operational war. They provide targeting. GPS is actually fed into weapon systems so that they can precisely target something on the ground. The missile warning satellites are being used for targeting. The remote sensing satellites, are much, much better, and you can see somebody's license plate from space. And so space infrastructure has been integrated now in a way that allows the U.S. to project power in a way that it never could before. And that's threatening to other countries.
Striking the right balance between getting a leg up and outright threatening your adversaries can be tricky, especially if the military is the only tool in the toolbox. Compared to other warfighting domains, like the sea or the air, there aren't a lot of formal rules for how the military can use space. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty says that no one can put weapons of mass destruction in space, but that's about it. There's not much appetite now for passing new treaties for space, but there are talks about establishing new norms to prevent issues like space debris and accidental collisions. And the only way to establish norms is to talk with other countries.
Remember, we're still cooperating with the Russians on the ISS. And even now, and despite all the politics and despite the head of Russia's Roscosmos, their NASA equivalent, saying nasty things on Twitter, being belligerent on Twitter, the ISS and the cosmonauts and the astronauts are doing fine.
It's true. Even with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and all of the sanctions, U.S. astronaut Mark Vande Hei, he just arrived safely back on Earth with 2 Russian cosmonauts using their rocket. But when tensions are high, Congress can decide to shut down this type of cooperation. And in some cases, they might never start it back up.
One of the big problems is that Congress passed laws years and years ago that make it very difficult for the U.S. to do any kind of space cooperation with China. NASA is not allowed to cooperate with China, which has created a problem.
It means that we don't know as much about what the Chinese are doing. And now that Chinese space capabilities are starting to challenge American dominance, talks are more important than ever. But Ukraine has put a wrench in those plans.
There's a new effort at the UN that was actually spearheaded by the UK to start talking about military norms of behavior. But those discussions were kiboshed by the Russians, who then invaded Ukraine a week later. There are a set of rules around how the military acts in the other domains that do not exist for military space activities, because we haven't been doing that many military space activities until the last maybe 10, 15 years. There just hasn't been thought processes put to that. Different countries have different views of what is threatening, what's responsible, what's not responsible. And that conversation has to be had. So I hope that we can start those conversations in May and that they can actually go somewhere, although I'm pretty worried about that right now.
Absent those conversations, the weaponization of space could be a foregone conclusion.
One of the maxims or the truisms of military strategy is that if one country gets too far out ahead in its offensive capability, other countries feel threatened. And then they feel like they have to build counter weapons. And this is the phenomena of an arms race. And that's what you're seeing in space right now, is essentially a proto-arms race.
These satellites are vulnerable to attack. They're much easier to attack than they are to defend. And this idea that fixing that might be building our own weapons to deter other people is, again, sort of that same thread. Like, what you're going to probably need to do is make them more resilient and have them hardened to types of interference you expect, have backups, have the ability to launch more quickly. But also, you need to have negotiated constraints, I think, on what types of technology are okay. Like, you want to have constraints on anti-satellite weapons and make your environment less threatening. Like, beef up those diplomatic initiatives.
While defense spending regularly gets big boosts from Congress, other areas of the government are not so easy to fund. The State Department's budget, for example, is tiny compared to defense.
There's a similar thread there that missile defenses are meant to solve technically something that's essentially a political problem. It's not going to solve the problem of North Korean missiles. It's not.
And the military alone is probably not going to solve the problem of space security either.
I guess my worst outcome is that we sort of forgo all of those negotiated things and just try to say, we'll fight it out, we'll end up better for it in the end. You're trying to achieve security by dominating the space environment and building weapons to keep others out. And I think there's no way to achieve that technically. I think that's just a really bad direction. I think you can tell that already, but there might be an incentive to try it out.
Back when Congress created NASA, it was faced with a world where Russia had just launched its first satellite. And the threat of conflict between world powers was very real. Despite this fact, it declared that activities in space should be devoted to peaceful purposes for the benefit of all mankind. Today, space is a part of our everyday lives, and it's more important to the military than it's ever been before. As Congress considers the national budget and everything they might like to do with defense, they still have a very important role to play in deciding how peaceful or dangerous space becomes.
I mean, I'm telling you guys, space is the place to watch right now. It's the budget package to watch. I will bet you money that Congress gives them even more money than they asked for.
I don't think I would take that bet. I think that you're right.
They're going to boost it, and I bet it goes up by $1 billion.
Things That Go Boom is distributed by Inkstick Media and PRX. This episode was produced by Nikki Galtland and me, and edited by Katie Toth and Christina Stella. As always, Darian Schulman writes the music for our show, and Robin Wise makes each episode sound its very best. Thank you to the supporters and foundations that make our work possible: the Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as Inkstick supporters, including the Colomb Foundation, Craig Newmark Foundation, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. If you're listening and you like what we do, please don't forget to head on over and leave us a review. And come visit us anytime on social at Inkstick Media. We'll see you right back here in 2 weeks. Have you seen the Space Force show? What did you think?
Oh my God, it's hilarious. I know it didn't get very good critical reviews, but I thought the first season was the funniest thing I ever saw, because whoever was advising them was like involved in the creation, because there were so many inside jokes there and so many things that actually they were blown up and exaggerated, but based on things that actually happened, that it was so funny.